Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast, or welcome for the first time if you are tuning in and listening to us for the first time. It is great to be in your ears. We're talking about eczema today, and we've covered eczema a lot on this podcast because it is one of the most common reasons that families seek our support, and we get some amazing results with eczema. There is so much that you can do when it comes to your child's eczema beyond steroid creams. And so we love talking about it. In today's episode, I want to talk about 4 completely different eczema underlying causes by sharing stories of 4 different clients that we've worked with, because it will help you to see the complexity of eczema, and that although primarily it's a skin condition, or we think of it as a skin condition, but when we look deeper, it is driven by other things internally. And by sharing these 4 stories, I hope you can get some insight as to whether your child maybe fits into one of these categories, which are, some of the common underlying causes that we see of eczema. But I think it also highlights the need for holistic support when it comes to eczema, because it's not just a skin condition. We want to make sure that we're looking deeper than just the skin and what creams we can put on the skin to improve and heal eczema. The stats on eczema are pretty frightening, pretty concerning. Eczema is on the rise, depending on what statistics and what age brackets you're looking at. Here in Australia, up to 1 in 3 children struggle with eczema. So it is very common, and obviously the degree and severity of that eczema varies a lot. Some kids have just mild eczema that is easily managed, and others have fairly severe eczema. And when I say eczema is more than just a skin condition, yes, it involves the immune system, it involves the gut, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today. But also what I'm referring to when I say that is that inflammation of the skin, the symptoms of eczema, really do impact a child's overall well-being, their mood, their behavior, their sleep. And then when we're looking at trying to treat eczema, particularly holistically, when we might be eliminating foods and looking at environmental factors, there's so much of a child's life that is affected by the symptoms of eczema and what we try to do to treat eczema, which is why it's so important and so helpful to get professional support and to have someone supporting you as the parent and guiding you as to just making things easier as we are, navigating eczema with your child. So I've been a clinical naturopath for 26 years now, and over all of the years that I have been practicing as a naturopath, seeing both children and adults with eczema, what I've learned is that eczema, is so variable in terms of what's driving it. It's never the exact same picture twice. Yes, we see common things happening. Yes, we see some common factors driving eczema, but looking individually at each child or person is really important. So today I'm going to share 4 real cases from our clinic, 4 different children with eczema, 4 completely different root causes, and 4 different paths to getting better and improving that eczema as well. So let's start with the first case story that I want to walk you through. So this was a 5-year-old who had had allergy testing and they had come back clear. So this particular child, this 5-year-old, had eczema and hay fever, and all the symptoms that go with hay fever as well. So congestion and itchy eyes and sneezing. But the reactions and her symptoms were random and inconsistent. There was no particular patterns that the parents could identify, which made it really tricky. And as I said, allergy testing had been done and the tests came back clear. So what we found from digging deeper, and when I say digging deeper, that can involve a whole range of things when we're working with clients. It definitely starts with comprehensive case history taking, and this is the thing that can often be lacking when we go to the GP because they just don't have the time to be looking at all the different factors. It's pretty much, what are the symptoms? What are your concerns? And they're having to come up with a really quick solution or prescription based on those symptoms that you're talking about. They don't have time, they might have time to ask you a few questions, of course, but they don't have time to look at what, a thorough health history of that child. What was going on in pregnancy? When that child was in utero, what happened through the birth process and in their early life? What is their diet like? What are their stress levels like? What, have they got any digestive symptoms, or how sick are they getting? And how often are they getting sick? So all of these things, and they're just a few examples, help us to build a complete picture when it comes to a child. So that is one part of, I guess, getting to digging deeper, getting to figure out what the underlying cause for a particular child is. And the other part of it is testing. So we can, there's all sorts of testing that can be helpful, whether it be blood testing, whether it be allergy testing, whether it be more functional tests like a gut microbiome test or a hair tissue mineral analysis. There's all sorts of testing that can be helpful. So, that just kind of, I just wanted to I guess, be clear in terms of when I say when we dug deeper, it can be a whole range of those things. So for this particular 5-year-old, what we uncovered was that there were some histamine issues going on. And what was happening, and this is a really common picture with eczema, is that the body isn't breaking down histamine effectively. And there can be a whole range of things that can contribute and affect how histamine is broken down in the body. One of those is how well our body is producing a particular enzyme called DAO, which breaks down histamine. So that's one aspect that we look at when we're looking at histamine breakdown. So this particular child, and it was fairly clear from the onset and the range of symptoms that this child had, that there was, a histamine intolerance. So what that means is that this little girl's histamine bucket was constantly overflowing, and that explained why flares seemed random and unpredictable. It wasn't like every time she has milk, she gets a flare. It wasn't as simple as that. And histamine intolerance is often overlooked. Well, one reason is that it's not a lot of medical practitioners, sort of don't recognize histamine intolerance. And another reason is because there isn't any pattern. It can be a little bit messy and inconsistent in terms of the symptoms and the flare-ups. But for us, that's a sign that it could be, related to histamine. So histamine is a natural substance that the body produces, but it is also found in high levels in certain foods. So whenever we are suspecting a histamine intolerance or a histamine issue, one thing that we do short term is put children on a low histamine diet. So it reduces that load pretty quickly. And so that can really help to minimize symptoms fairly quickly. But we don't want a child to be staying on a low histamine diet long term, because histamine is high in foods that actually have a lot of benefits. So, for example, fermented foods are high in histamine. So if your child is, if you're increasing the amount of fermented foods in the diet of your child with eczema because you're thinking that that's going to help, but their symptoms are getting worse, then that could be pointing to, issues with histamine or a histamine intolerance. So we don't want to reduce histamine in the diet for too long. We want to, and this is what we did with this child, put this particular child on a low histamine diet short term. But more importantly, we used targeted gut and immune support, nutrients, herbs, gut healing to improve the body's ability to improve her ability to process histamine long term. And so with this 5-year-old, we saw improvements in her eczema and her hay fever symptoms fairly quickly with that low histamine diet. But longer term, and we're talking about, a few months, she went from needing daily steroid creams and taking almost daily antihistamine medication and still struggling with symptoms because they were really only, just sort of managing the severity of the symptoms, making them a little bit more manageable, but they weren't actually getting rid of the problem. So she went from these daily steroid creams and antihistamines to needing neither of these medications. She doesn't need steroid creams anymore. She doesn't need antihistamines hardly ever anymore. And she was also able to introduce some of those high histamine foods back into her diet over time as well. So an important thing to note here is that histamine intolerance, there isn't a test for it. It won't show up on a standard allergy test. There's no test that you can do that determines that you have histamine issues or histamine intolerance. So it really comes from, a health practitioner putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And there can be some helpful functional tests that can point, in the direction that histamine might be an issue. So that was a really good outcome for this 5-year-old. The second case I want to talk about was a 6-month-old. So a much younger child who had been diagnosed with cow's milk protein allergy. So that was already diagnosed early on because of she had eczema and she also had a lot of gut symptoms as well, as cow's milk protein allergy babies often do. There can be a lot of reflux, a lot of vomiting, and, it often also goes hand in hand with eczema, not always. So the gut symptoms had improved. So there'd obviously been improvements by removing dairy from this little 6-month-old's diet. And this 6-month-old was being breastfed. So mum had completely removed dairy from her diet. But the eczema had not improved. If anything, the eczema had gotten worse. Now, this little bub had been on multiple courses of antibiotics in the first few months of her life. And so that, and also because of the cow's milk protein allergy, we knew that, her gut probably needed some work, needed some building up, needed some attention. So the gut microbiome had been severely disrupted by that early antibiotic exposure. And of course, that removal of dairy when there's a cow's milk protein allergy that had been diagnosed is important, but it was only part of the picture. And this is the important thing to remember and realize about allergies. A lot of parents feel that, oh, yay, not yay, but at least we've got an answer. My child is allergic to this particular food, in this case, dairy. So if we remove that, that's all we have to do. But removing an allergen is only part of the picture. And this story is a really great example of that. The gut microbiome and the gut function in this child needed rebuilding. So we used a bit of a gut healing, gut rebuilding protocol. And in a 6-month-old, that is very simple and straightforward. We're not using piles of supplements or anything like that. But there are certain eczema and allergy specific probiotic strains that were really helpful in this case. And as I said, a gentle gut healing protocol that was implemented by both mum because she was breastfeeding and directly to bubs as well, where safe. And within a few months, the eczema cleared up completely. Now, this mum did not want to use steroid creams. It was one of the reasons she had come to see us, because she was trying to manage her baby's eczema without using steroid creams. And we used a completely internal approach. She kept using a very basic natural based cream that she was already using. So nothing external was changed. It was all an inside job, if you like. So I guess the point I want to make and reiterate in this case is that food allergy diagnosis is not the whole picture. So even when the trigger food is removed, the gut is often still the missing piece, especially when babies or children have had, ongoing antibiotics exposure or early antibiotic exposure. So that was a really good story, good outcome case as well. The third story I want to share with you is an older child, a 10-year-old, who had been through the ringer, if you like, with lots of elimination diet trials. So this 10-year-old had eczema since he was 2. On and off. So the severity of the eczema definitely was up and down and on and off. But over the last couple of years, it had gotten worse. And so parents had tried over the years, the 8 years, with some degree of improvement, but then, symptoms worsening again, but had tried dairy, gluten, egg, corn, soy food eliminations. None of which made, a meaningful difference. Like none of them got rid of the eczema completely. Sometimes there was, improvements, but that was all a bit murky as well. So this child's eczema was consistently worse overnight. So the itching was worse overnight, which obviously leads to a lot of sleep issues, which then leads to mood and behavioral challenges because we have a tired child all the time. But this was a clue for us. Eczema consistently worse, the scratching, the itching worse overnight and in the morning. And this child often woke up grumpy and congested. I'm wondering if you can spot the pattern here and what we picked up. So what we picked up was a potential dust mite allergy. And we sent this child off for an allergy test and it was confirmed. Dust mite allergy was confirmed. And that eczema worsening overnight and in the morning and that waking up with congestion, there's some red flags or little clues that it is a dust mite problem, because dust mites are generally higher in bedrooms where there's soft furnishings and mattresses and, pillows and carpets and those sorts of things. So dust mite allergy was confirmed. And what we did was informed and educated the parents about reducing dust mite load in the bedroom specifically. And there is so much that we can do to reduce that dust mite exposure in the bedroom. There's nothing, with environmental allergies, it can be hard because we can't completely get rid of the exposure like we can in a much easier way with food. If a child is allergic to a food, we can just make sure that it's not going into their body. It's not always, completely foolproof, of course, but with environmental allergies, it can be a lot harder to control. But there are lots of things that we can do, and educated these parents on reducing that dust mite exposure, particularly in the bedroom. And some families even go to the extreme of ripping up carpets, because that can make a big difference, particularly in older carpets as well. We also recommended and prescribed some nutritional supplements to support immune function and immune regulation to reduce how reactive the immune system was over time to dust mites. And we used creams to support and improve the skin barrier as well. Those dust mites are being exposed to on the outside, of course. And so whatever we can do to strengthen and support the skin barrier is going to help as well. And this 10-year-old's eczema improved significantly. So this one is interesting because I think we often think straight to food when we're thinking about eczema and allergies and sensitivities and intolerances. But environmental triggers are massively under investigated and often not looked at or thought of. And as I said, the timing of the symptoms is one of the most valuable kind of clues in this case. Whenever symptoms are worse overnight, in the morning, then, dust mites are definitely something that we are considering. And our final story that I want to share with you was a 3-year-old little girl. She had very severe eczema covering 70% of her body. She was really struggling with sleep. She was awake for 2 to 3 hours every night with intense itching and scratching. Steroid creams had been used but hadn't really been that helpful. And this family really was at breaking point. It was very distressing for the whole family. Eczema can just be heartbreaking for families and parents. Obviously, the child who is experiencing the discomfort, but you can feel really helpless as a parent. I'm sure if you're listening to this and your child has eczema, you can somewhat relate depending on how severe your child's eczema is. So what we found with this little girl was there was a whole a range of different things. This was quite a complex case, and there was multiple, overlapping drivers for her eczema. We sort of pinpointed and highlighted that there was some gut and immune dysfunction. There was a high histamine load. There were specific food triggers that mum had already sort of highlighted were a problem, and there were some environmental factors as well. So we supported the gut and the immune system. We used some targeted supplements for eczema, and this involved looking at improving the skin barrier, improving the skin healing, improving gut healing, and supporting immune regulation to make it that little bit less reactive. We did put this little girl on a low histamine diet, a lower histamine diet. And at the same time, we increased prebiotics in supplements and in foods, and improved bedroom hygiene. So just washing those sheets more regularly. And when there's environmental factors, hot washing bedding can make a really big difference. And using more allergy appropriate bedding can really help as well. So this case took a little bit of time in terms of getting some meaningful results. We did see improvements in this case quickly in a sort of small way, but when we kept going, we did see some really amazing improvements. She was able to stop using steroid creams that weren't really working for her well anyway. Her eczema was massively better, and she was barely waking up at night as well. So that was huge in terms of her overall well-being. There was a bit of a setback with this little girl after she needed to go on some antibiotics after a urinary tract infection, and her eczema flared again. But this was quite a ways into her treatment, and she'd, stopped some of the supplements because she didn't need them anymore. So what we recommended, and when I say we, there was these were all one-on-one clients that were working with one of our practitioners. So the practitioner that this little girl was working with, which was Sarah, just, returned to the daily use of the supplements, the gut and the immune supplements, paused reintroduction of food. So she was at a really good place before she went on the antibiotics, where they were reintroducing some of those trigger foods back into her diet and doing that fairly successfully, returning gluten and dairy products slowly but surely into her diet. But then she had this setback, so we paused that reintroduction of trigger foods, returned to those key supplements that were supporting her gut and her immune system, and she fully recovered to no eczema, no itching. So this is a really good example of a complex case with multiple overlapping drivers or underlying factors, where a single elimination diet or a single probiotic supplement or a cream will just never be enough because there's multiple things going on here. And I think it's also a really good example that setbacks are common and a normal part of the process, and staying calm and knowing how to respond to them. And it really helps if you've got a practitioner that can support you through this, is just as important as the initial treatment plan. So I hope it's been helpful to listen to those 4 stories. And I guess what they've all got in common is that none of them responded to the standard approach of find the allergy, remove the food or the allergen, apply the cream. It really highlights that eczema is more complex than that, and that every case has its own individual driving factor or multiple driving factors. And I think it really also highlights that eczema is so much more than a skin condition. It involves the immune system and it involves the gut as well as the skin. And when we properly investigate the gut and how it's functioning, the immune system and how it's functioning, things like histamine load and environmental triggers and the gut microbiome specifically, we can really get some good results for eczema. Now, if you're listening to this episode as it's coming out in the week that it's coming out, which is mid-May 2026, I am holding a eczema and allergies masterclass. It's free. It's all about our natural approach to eczema and allergies. And I've run this before. It's been really popular, and due to popular demand, I am running it again. So if you head on over to our Instagram at Natural Super Kids or our website, naturalsuperkids.com, you will find the link to be able to sign up for the masterclass. You'll also find it in the show notes of this episode. I'd love to see you there. It's free. You'll be able to ask me questions. You'll get a lot of value and learn a lot about our approach to eczema and allergies. And if you enjoyed this episode, you will really enjoy the masterclass. So I hope to see you there, and I'll be back next week talking more about eczema and allergies. Next week's episode, I'm talking about some of the things that we do differently when it comes to kids with eczema and allergies. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.